Right now, we know for a fact the Russians are engaged in a major offensive operation around Avdiivka. We also know that they're engaged in a major offensive operation in the northeast, in Luhansk and in Kharkiv. The Ukrainian command should, in principle, have the resources and the vehicles and the planning bandwidth available to be able to think, okay, hypothetically, if we manage to attrit the Russians by this amount, and after they take Avdiivka, then we can have a prepared counterattack at the operational level of war ready to go charge into the exhausted Russians here and exploit those conditions. You can also have the same planning that goes for what's happening right now in the east, in the northeast, near Luhansk and Kharkiv. We have exhaust Russian forces here. They've been conducting offensive operations since the beginning of January. Let's say they're going to be exhausted come March, April. At some point around then, the Ukrainians can then conduct an attack to take advantage of that and put the Russians off their footing.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Hansen. And today we're talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine with George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War. George is the head of their Russia team. George, welcome back to Frontline.
Thanks so much for having me, James. Good to see you again.
Just wanted to begin with, I suppose, the big story out of Ukraine over recent days, which is that General Zaluzhny has been dismissed as Ukraine's military commander-in-chief and replaced by Alexander Siersky. Just tell us a bit about Siersky.
Sure. Alexander Siersky is one of Ukraine's most senior professional officers. He's been involved in fighting against Russian forces since 2014 with the initial incursions into the Donbass. Most recently, at the beginning of 22, with the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Siersky commanded the defense of Kyiv. He participated in the successful September 2022 counteroffensive that liberated much of northeastern Ukraine and Kharkiv Oblast. And then since then, he was the commander of the Ukrainian defensive effort around Bakhmut.
Let's come on to the current situation on the front line itself. It feels to me like we're in this situation where not much is happening on the front line. There's a lot of positional warfare, Russia continuing to try and make advances on Avdiivka. What is your reading of the situation?
Yeah, right now is an extremely difficult time for Ukrainian forces. Of course, they were not successful with their stated objectives for the 2023 counteroffensive, and Ukrainian forces have largely culminated. They're now facing critical shortages of materiel and also manpower, and the Russians have the initiative throughout the theater. Since the beginning of January 2024, the Russians have managed to capture over 100 square kilometers of territory in Ukraine. They've actually managed to capture a couple of villages since then as well, Khmelny and Kharkiv Oblast, and then Vesele, just north of Bakhmut. And of course, the Russians have been able to make some very dangerous inroads into the city of Avdiivka. The Russians have, of course, penetrated and breached the actual boundary for the city, and they are now fighting building to building, street by street. And it seems that there's nothing preventing the Russians to be able to replicate the highly destructive tactics of being able to brute force gains within the urban confines of a city at the expense of a tremendous amount of power, manpower, and equipment. So the Russians are currently in a big offensive. They're capitalizing off of the Ukrainian culmination, and the Russians seek to, I think, capture Avdiivka and possibly try to capture the remaining 2% of Luhansk Oblast that remains in Ukraine's hands before Russian President Vladimir Putin's choreographed re-election upcoming this March.
That's the aim, isn't it? They want to capture Avdiivka in time for the Russian presidential election to present a kind of symbolic victory, and yet it hasn't happened so far. We've been talking about Avdiivka for months on Frontline. Russia all the time trying to encircle it, trying to capture it. It hasn't happened so far. How do you rate the prospect of it happening before the Russian presidential election?
You know, it's difficult to say. The Russians have been able to successfully breach the city. They've made inroads in the northern part. They've made inroads in the southern part. And from the Russian tactical experience in conducting urban warfare, we have a couple of really good examples. Of course, the protracted siege and then clearing of Mariupol, and also the clearing of Bakhmut. The Russians have demonstrated that they're able to take on really heavy losses and slowly but surely eke out those tactical gains to deprive the Ukrainians of a city, and once they've reduced it to rubble and actually penetrated its grounds. I'm not sure if the Russians will succeed in capturing it in time for the elections, but frankly, I would not be surprised if they did.
I wanted to ask you about something reported by the ISW, your organisation, the Institute for the Study of War, very recently, that Russian forces appear to have constructed a 30-kilometre-long barrier dubbed the Tsar Train in the occupied Donetsk Oblast. Just tell us a bit about that and what the significance of it is.
Sure. This is a continuation of the Russian efforts to try to, as much as possible, fortify the occupied parts of Ukraine to make its subsequent liberation substantially more difficult. Open source researchers use satellite imagery to detect a whole long line of Russian Ukrainian rail cars that were stacked up in a consecutive line along an existing railroad line in Donetsk Oblast behind the occupied lines. And it is a curious feature because generally you don't stack up 30 kilometers worth of rail cars in one consecutive line, unless, of course, you're trying to make a wall of steel that effectively serves as a field fortification. So the running assessment is that this anomalous object is likely another form of Russian field fortifications. Of course, we've seen the trench networks, we've seen the landmine infrastructure, we've seen the tank traps and the dragon's teeth, and now to the mix of these things, there seems to be this so-called SAR wall of a whole bunch of trains.
Do we know how effective a defensive structure that will be?
You know, defensive structures in general are not that interesting unless they're properly manned or defended in depth. It's far from clear if the Russians are going to be able to successfully exploit it as part of an operational design, as part of elastic defense. The Russians were able to successfully defend the front line in southern Ukraine against the 2023 counteroffensive precisely because the actual geography of the battlefield was conducive to elastic defense. That is a tactic in which you deliberately plan to be able to attrit the enemy on the attack. You will cede your forwardmost positions. And after having exhausted the enemy, you then conduct a counterattack where you fight back to your initial positions. And notably with an object like this, with the SAR train, it basically being an impenetrable wall of rail cars, I'm not sure how conducive that is to ceding a position and then going back across over it, given it seems to be a barrier that's much more difficult to get across than, say, trenches or field fortifications. So it's difficult to say, but I'm not that particularly concerned about it because, of course, field fortifications, fixed fortifications can always be outmaneuvered and they can always be destroyed, provided your attacking force has studied it in enough detail.
What are the big strategic debates now facing Ukraine as they look towards the rest of 2024?
Sure. There's a big policy debate now about what should the Ukrainian strategy for victory look like as the Ukrainians, of course, lick their wounds from 2023, the question about sustained Western support and how the Ukrainians can actually go ahead and achieve victory. There is a current argument that's been quite persuasive, I think, about how the Ukrainians must hold and not conduct any offensive operations of scale in 2024 in order so that the Ukrainians can rebuild their combat potential, become re-equipped, recruit more troops, and then go on the big offensive in 2025. The Institute, we've engaged with this argument and we respectfully disagree. We have a slightly more nuanced take, I think, which is that that approach actually cedes the strategic initiative across the theater to the Russians. That allows the Russians to conduct offensives of their own intensity at their place and time of choosing. And of course, when you're conducting the defensive on the Ukrainian side, that requires the Ukrainians to use equipment and materiel that they would theoretically be building up for this 2025 endeavor. So really, ideally, the Ukrainians should try to contest the Russians wherever they can as part of a phased, planned, cogent campaign, and actually a design of a series of sequential campaigns in order to contest that initiative so that it's not just the Russians being allowed to choose, here's where we're going to pin Ukrainian forces, here's where we're going to force the Ukrainians to deploy certain kinds of assets that they're trying to build up for their big offensive operation. The Ukrainians should actually be empowered so that they can contest that initiative. And of course, in war, whoever controls the initiative the most is generally at the advantage. The other issue is, of course, that the Ukrainians are not going to conduct a single decisive large operation in 2025. generally speaking, when you're conducting state warfare between two large, powerful states, there isn't a single decisive operation. Defeat usually, or victory usually, comes as a result of a culmination of a series of successful campaigns planned in order to achieve your strategic objectives. So I think there's a little bit of hand-wavy thinking about how there's going to be a single decisive Ukrainian operation in 25. Of course, we need to plan so that the Ukrainians can tit for tat with the Russians, build up what they need to, and weasel the Russians away out of the ability to dictate the tempo of the battlefield.
I suppose just to play devil's advocate, those making the arguments in favour of this strategy would say that instead of one operation, if you had a Ukrainian counter-offensive more effective than the one we saw last year, that might be the breakthrough moment, and that you might need these 12 months in order to prepare Ukraine for that.
I would agree, yes. That it would be better to have a more successful counteroffensive than what we saw last year. However, part of the reason why the Russian defense was as successful as it was number one, the Ukrainian offensive effort was under-resourced in general. So the resourcing has to kick up substantially for that. And then number two, the Russians were able to do what they did because they were uncontested for so long. Following the Ukrainian counteroffensive in fall 2022, the Russians got a good 6 months plus to be able to literally dig in, create the field fortifications, and stabilize the problems. Of course, Russian mobilization of the 300,000 that was wildly unpopular in Russia and caused millions of Russian men to flee Russia, that was in response to the Ukrainian counteroffensive in September. The Russians were much more unprepared to be able to deal with a consecutive Ukrainian operation at that point. So by not sufficiently supplying the Ukrainians, by giving the Russians months and months of reprieve to build up and prepare, that is actually a key enabling factor and a lost opportunity for Ukraine.
How would you assess the strength of Russia's defense industrial base at the moment, George?
The Russians are doing pretty well. Of course, they still have hiccups and they're still ironing out the problems and the kinks, but they're doing quite well. The Russians, of course, with their most recent federal budget, they've increased their spending substantially. They're dedicating 9% of their federal spending towards national security, which, of course, isn't as much as what the Russians did during the Cold War, when the Soviet government used to spend about 12 to 17% of their GDP on defense. But this figure of about 9% of their spending going to defense, that's about commensurate with what the United States military was spending on defense in the 1980s. Most of that is going to equipment procurement, and they're being quite successful. The Russians have been able to use a network of foreign partners to evade sanctions and procure parts necessary to produce and replenish their supplies of precision-guided munitions. Last fall, the Russians managed to overcome the initial slump from sanctions, and they're now at the same production rate for precision-guided munitions as what they had prior to when the 2022 invasion began. The Russians are also able to refurbish a significant number of tanks. Figures vary, but the UK Ministry of Defense said it was about 100 tanks a month that the Russians are refurbishing. Latvian Defense put it between 100 and 150 or so. So the Russians are still getting material out. They're also in a better place in terms of the recruitment. The Russians now have the flexibility to be able to conduct some tactical over rotations, operational over rotations to reprieve and give rest to units that are deployed to the front. And what's even more alarming is the Russians are now also negotiating with the Central African Republic the deployment of a contingent of Russian soldiers to go help out the Central African Republic with counterterrorism in Africa. That's particularly alarming, of course, because in 2022, the Russians, very hurriedly scrambled all of their forces that they have at their various foreign deployed bases in Armenia, contractors at the Kand Air Base in Kyrgyzstan, etc. So to see now, going into the third year of this war almost, that the Russians are comfortable enough that they can now talk about having expeditionary foreign deployed forces in new countries where they previously haven't operated, it's an indicator that they're doing a lot better than they were previously.
It is really fascinating how the Kremlin is establishing these geopolitical relations across the world. Obviously, there's a lot of focus with Moscow's relationship with North Korea and also Iran. But, I mean, interestingly, CNN has reported that Russia has recruited as many as 15,000 Nepalese soldiers. What do you make of that?
Yeah, the Russians have for a long time been augmenting their own force generation in part by recruiting financially vulnerable foreigners to come fight and augment Russian forces. We, of course, have this most recent investigation that was done by CNN last week, which is really great, talking about how there's apparently between 14 to 15,000 Nepalese soldiers that are fighting or have fought in Ukraine. And that's consistent with reports that we've seen from the ground. ISW has been reporting on Nepalese soldiers fighting in Ukraine for several months now. It was back in December, I think, that we started to see our first confirmed reports of Nepalese soldiers fighting in Ukraine. The Nepalese embassy and ambassador in Russia has complained about issues related to that. And, it's really unfortunate because you see these various different financially vulnerable populations that the Russians see as just cannon fodder to help them stabilize their own fourth generation efforts so that they can get to the point where the Russians are out of panic mode and they're able to more readily sustain and wage this war effort as they've optimized their various different schemes to be able to keep men and material going to the front. So it's quite sad and quite unfortunate.
Is there an awareness? I mean, I appreciate what you say that these are financially vulnerable soldiers who are going to fight for Russia, but is there an awareness that they are essentially going to be used as cannon fodder?
I think so, yeah. It's difficult to tell exactly in which role every single one of these soldiers are going to fight. But, there's the story that the CNN put forward about this one particular soldier. He fought on the front lines in Bakhmut. And that, of course, was an extremely difficult, bloody urban combat environment with very heavy Russian losses. We've seen reports that Nepalese, I believe also Serbian fighters fighting in Russian airborne units, the 106th Division, which was also previously operating in the Bakhmut area, if I recall correctly. The airborne forces, of course, are one of Russia's most elite branches of forces, and they are given some of the most difficult combat tasks. So to see these foreign fighters get put into those units that typically engage in some of the most difficult kind of fighting indicates that, of course, yeah, they're taking the financially vulnerable. The other big component of that, of course, are the sums of money reportedly that these fighters will actually go to Ukraine for. Reportedly, these Nepalese fighters are being recruited on a basis of only $2,000 a month, which, of course, for most Westerners is not a whole lot of money. But when you look at the kind of economic mobility that exists in countries like Nepal or what their rate of unemployment is, $2,000 a month can actually be quite a lot.
And I know a lot of people have said Putin does not want any more mobilization of Russian troops before the presidential election. Do you think that will change post the vote?
Yes, I think it's likely that Putin will conduct a mobilization at some point in the future. It's very unlikely to occur within the couple of weeks that we have left here until March. But yes, the Russian government will likely conduct mobilization in the future. And it's unclear exactly when they will, because I think Putin will try to stave off that effort as long as possible. The Russians right now have what we call a crypto mobilization campaign, which is essentially a series of opaque efforts to try to get so-called Russian volunteers to sign up for military service. And they're promised on paper to receive all the benefits of Russian professional contract service, high salaries, benefits in case they're wounded or killed in action, but also for their families, so on and so forth. But the Russians have been very legally duplicitous with what kind of rights volunteers actually have in the Russian military entitlement system. And in principle, they're not actually entitled to all that much. And this effort has nonetheless duped thousands of Russians, and the Russians generate about 20,000 recruits through this scheme every month. That said, more Russians every single day are learning about how actually, as a volunteer, you have a different status under Russian law. You're actually entitled to all these things despite what the recruiters say. And so that sum is actually decreasing. And at some point, I think Putin will try to ride that out as long as he can to stave off the deeply unpopular mobilization. But I'm confident there will become a time again where more mobilization will likely be necessary.
Just want to go back to that interesting debate about the strategy Ukraine should be pursuing over the next 12 months or so. Let's say they don't adopt a defensive posture, a purely defensive posture for the next 12 months, and they do try and launch a few offensive operations. Where do you think they may target? I'm not going to give any specific answers because it's a matter of policy for ISW to forecast Ukrainian operations. But I will say,
there should be, the Soviets call this operational art. It's the concept of the stringing out and the deliberate design of multiple successive and sometimes simultaneous operations in order to lead to the strategic effects you seek to bring about in your adversary. Right now, we know for a fact the Russians are engaged in a major offensive operation around Avdiivka. We also know that they're engaged in a major offensive operation in the northeast, in Luhansk and in Kharkiv. The Ukrainian command should, in principle, have the resources and the vehicles and the planning bandwidth available to be able to think, okay, hypothetically, if we manage to attrit the Russians by this amount, and after they take Avdiivka, then we can have a prepared counterattack at the operational level of war ready to go charge into the exhausted Russians here and exploit those conditions. You can also have the same planning that goes for what's happening right now in the east, in the northeast, near Luhansk and Kharkiv. We have exhaust Russian forces here. They've been conducting offensive operations since the beginning of January. Let's say they're going to be exhausted come March, April. At some point around then, the Ukrainians can then conduct an attack to take advantage of that and put the Russians off their footing. With the current, with the other strategy we postulate is you just defend, you husband your material, and of course, that gives the Russians assurance that, okay, they can grind out tactical gains in Avdiivka and then consolidate it uncontested. They can grind out tactical gains in the northeast and then consolidate it uncontested. So I'm not going to forecast specifically where the Ukrainians should conduct these attacks, but the competent command should have the ability to think about how are we going to exploit these opportunities and not just take, targets of opportunity, but specifically plan and know we know the Russians have an effort here. There's a center of gravity that's building it here. How are we going to exploit that?
And do you think Ukraine has the capacity at the moment to launch such an offensive given the issues with supplies from the West?
At this time, no. It's quite clear that the Ukrainians do not have that capacity at this time, and it is purely because of insufficient quantities of material. Manpower is also an issue, of course. Ukrainian forces are running low on infantry, and the Ukrainians need to conduct more force generation activities. They have to increase more mobilization. But there's very little sense in sending a whole bunch of dismounted infantry who don't have vehicle support or who don't have sufficient artillery cover. This is, of course, primarily an artillery war, to go and fight when they're under-resourced. So it makes sense to conserve until they get the material they need.
Has it surprised you that Congress has still not passed renewed military aid for Ukraine? I mean, there seems to be this dispute over this border bill. Now the Republicans are playing political games over it. But just before Christmas, there was an expectation that it might be approved within weeks, certainly within the first few weeks of the new year. Here we are now almost in mid-February and there's no sign of it. Has that taken you by surprise, George?
No comment for now. I'm not really an expert on American political developments. I will just say that, the delays in aid, not just at this juncture of the debate, it's particularly bad now, but historically, throughout the entire course of this Russian invasion since 2022, if I had to describe in a quick phrase, the way that I would characterize Western responses and American funding of this war is, of course, a war of lost opportunities. And really, these gaps in funding, these gaps in provisions, and also not providing the right kinds of tools at the time. We've had a debate for how long about F-16s, only to have them eventually get greenlit. Same thing about, Abrams tanks, too little, too late, and, lost opportunities. So ideally, policymakers will realize that, of course, we have from a selfish American and a selfish NATO perspective, it's very important that we as an alliance impose a strategic defeat on Russia to restore credibility for a deterrence for the NATO alliance and prepare our ability to defend the alliance should the Russians seek to destroy NATO. And we also need to help the Ukrainians, liberate their territory, liberate their people, and make Ukraine a prosperous state that will not perpetually be a ward of the international community.
But it is notable, despite the lack of further military aid from the West, that Ukraine has had some victories in recent months, in particular, obviously, the ongoing success in terms of targeting the Black Sea Fleet, but also targeting Russian energy infrastructure. Has that surprised you? And do you think Ukraine can sustain that over the coming months?
Yeah, doesn't surprise me at all. The Ukrainians have been striking objects within Russia proper. I don't consider Crimea to be Russia proper. That's obviously Ukraine, but actually the actual Russian mainland since the beginning of this war. And the Ukrainians have been developing indigenous capabilities to be able to do that. They're building their own drones that are able to, with a range of up to 1,000 kilometers and a payload of up to 75 kilograms. They're working on creating smaller unmanned systems that are able to, with a shorter radius, but still able to go into Russia to be able to strike those objects. And of course, there seems to be this weird, which I still don't understand, a Western policy embargo on allowing the Ukrainians to use Western supplied munitions to strike mainland Russia. The Russians, of course, consider Crimea to be Russia. They don't doubt that at all. Yet we allow the Ukrainians to use Storm Shadows and other weapon systems to strike Crimea, which have had, I think, good operational effects, as you correctly note. But there still seems to be this taboo against striking things in Belgorod Oblast or Rostov-on-Don. And that, of course, is a major capability for the Russians. We've essentially, by policy, granted the Russians a sanctuary space in which that they can assemble forces, prepare forces, and then immediately project them into Ukraine. The Ukrainians are using their own stuff to hit that, which is not surprising at all. And it, of course, has not resulted with any major escalation other than what the Russians have already done. So I think hopefully the policy debate, one of the other policy debates will become about, are we really going to tolerate allowing the Russians to have a sanctuary in immediately adjacent to Ukraine from which the Russians can use to bolster their defenses, when really the policy objective should be, how do we weaken Russian capabilities as much to enable those successful Ukrainian offensives that we're planning for in the future?
It's really interesting. I mean, were that policy to change, how transformative could that be for Ukraine's prospects?
It would be quite substantial. I mean, you can look at where all the Russian stationary ground targets are, or just military bases and military targets in the immediate vicinity of Ukraine. The Russian 8 Combined Arms Army, one of the principal armies that captured and took siege from Mariupol, that with its 150th Motorized Rifle Division, that's garrisoned in the immediate side of the Russian-Ukrainian international border in Rostov-on-Don. There's a variety of oil complexes, bridges, roads, key ground lines of communication, logistics infrastructure, all legitimate military targets under the norms and law of international armed conflict that the Ukrainians have, in fact, already been targeting for a long time with their indigenous systems. And if the Western provided aid can also strike those systems, then I'm confident in the Ukrainians' ability to be able to use successful interdiction to destroy and degrade the Russian performance in the battlefield. I'll add actually one really pertinent example: the Kherson counteroffensive of summer 2022. I know it's been a long time for the listeners, but recall how, purely because the Ukrainians received the American-supplied HIMARS rocket artillery, they were able to shoot at the Antonovsky Bridge, that crosses the Dnipro River, and in doing so, deprive the main avenue for egress and also the main logistics artery that supplied Russian forces on the northern part of the Dnipro River. That interdiction campaign by itself, just turning that bridge into Swiss cheese, it made the whole geography of the territory on the right bank of that river untenable, and the Russians pulled out with there not being a major fight for Kherson city. So these systems, I think, put to good use, can achieve some substantial operational effects.
Just finally, George, obviously you do brilliant work at the Institute for the Study of War and follow the conflict very closely every day. What will you be looking most closely at over the coming weeks and months?
Sure. Russian force generation efforts, of course, are going to be major for us to follow, to see and assess their capabilities, how they're learning and growing. The big other thing that we'll be looking at is the Ukrainian defense industrial base. There is a strategy that the Ukrainians have developed to make themselves self-sufficient and less reliant on perpetually receiving billions of dollars, billions of euros worth of foreign financial and security assistance. And that is, of course, creating Ukraine's own defense industry within Ukraine proper, but also in partnership with NATO states in Central and Eastern Europe, countries like Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and so on and so forth. I think that effort is really key because if the Ukrainians are successful over the next year or 2 years to be able to build up that defense industrial base of their own, they will become de facto less reliant on large amounts of foreign aid, and the kinds of needs that they have will be more niche and more targeted. So those will be really key to watch for the coming years, so that we can keep Ukraine's defense sustainable without having to, of course, give up to Russia's aggressive demands for its war of conquest.
George, always appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today on Frontline.
Thanks for having me, James. Always a pleasure.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.